Hi everyone, welcome. I'm preparing to feed a couple of my worm bins, and the stuff that you see out here are the items that I plan to use in today's feeding. The stuff out here on these two coffee filters are the foods they're getting. So they're getting some sort of dried berries. They're kind of like raisins, but they were just in the back of the cupboard. Who knows how old these things were. This white stuff that you see here is just some dried coconut, something I don't even know if I've ever fed my worms. That too, just another one of those things that sort of surfaced from the back of the cupboard. These things, it's interesting, they were so much whiter when I bought them down here. These are some chopped up avocado pits. One avocado pit chopped up into multiple slices, split up, you know, to make sure each bin gets a fair shake at that stuff there. So that's the feeding, which we'll supplement with some of my worm chow. And the other things that you see here are, I remember one of the bins had a feeding zone indicator and the other one didn't. So here's this extra coffee filter to help balance things out. In that same vein, one of the systems has some cardboard in there, which the other system doesn't have. That's what these pieces of cardboard are coming into play to help balance things out. So those are going to go into the system that doesn't have the cardboard already. And then these are just a couple of new pieces of top covering newspaper that I fashioned to go in to replace the existing ones. And the existing ones will just get used as the bedding for today's feeding, along with some of this stuff here, some soiled paper towels, some soiled napkins, even some of the trimmings of the new top covering newspaper bits that I had fashioned to go in here today. So some of this other stuff here, grit, pulverized eggshell is what I use as grit, and even this stuff, this is coming back into service. Those of you that have been on my channel already know that this is my mosquito dunks solution, BTI solution. I started noticing some flying insects in some of my bins, so this stuff is meant to try to combat those. So I'm going to move all this stuff aside. We're going to get these bins up on the bench, and we're going to get them fed. So let's get to work. So as we usually do, we're starting with the older of the two systems. This system's been in service now for 89 days. And the worms that occupy this system actually took a little detour before they ended up in this bin. These are the European nightcrawlers that I had originally started running in my breeder bins. And they ran in the breeder bins, or breeder buckets, 3 breeder buckets for 4 weeks, for 28 days, after which they were placed into here. And speaking of breeding, I think that's what we're seeing here. And it's kind of unusual because normally it's 2 worms that you see latched up to one another, but here it looks like we've got 3. Yeah, you know, I think because of these really bright lights, they're going to be detaching from one another and trying to scurry away from the bright lights, but that's definitely 3 worms trying to get busy with one another. I don't see that very often, that's for sure. And you could already see these, it's like a tug of war. They're trying to like pull away in opposite directions, and I guess they're going to just eventually have to release from one another so that they can squirm away. I feel bad walking in on the wormies while they're busy doing stuff like this, but, well, we're going to have to feed, and we're going to have to get them off this top covering newspaper, because this newspaper is going to go into the system as, you know, the bedding that's going to go in underneath the foods that we're going to be putting in. So we're going to need this stuff shortly. A lot of times I would just fold these top coverings over so that the worms hanging out can, you know, just sort of stay within and on the paper that they're in or on and not be disrupted too much by my presence. But since this paper is sort of going to be transitioning from top covering into bedding, we're going to be needing it soon once we open up a spot to place the food. So besides this piece of paper, here's another piece of paper, and this is the system that actually has those cardboard strips in it. So we're already catching a glimpse of some of the materials that are going to be becoming the bedding for today's feeding. And as you can see, it's a pretty good bit, right? So there's this, and there's these. And it's kind of a comparable quantity of cardboard. This stuff's been just sitting in here for a while now, soaking and getting nibbled a little bit and whatever else. So I think by placing it down in the feeding area, it's going to finally get it to the point where it might start breaking up. So this is what I plan on putting into the other system. It's sort of a similar amount, perhaps not quite as much, but close. So here again, let's just remove this stuff so we can make room for today's feeding. Going kind of big on bedding has sort of been my theme lately in all my systems. And it seems to me almost like once we place all this stuff down into a hole over here and backfill it, we're going to be bringing up the overall amount of material in the system considerably. You know, not to mention that we've also got some of this stuff that we plan on, you know, sinking down into the system as bedding too. So I guess we'll see, but I guess that's also going to be helping me, you know, drive towards that goal. Oh man, I feel so bad disrupting worms while they're busy doing this, but I guess these two were just so into it that they just can't seem to resist staying coupled together. So now the feeding they got last time, they got stuff that I think is not going to last. It was stuff like mushroom. Worms love mushroom. It was stuff like carrot peels, and they love carrot peels. And there was a third item. It's evading me right now. I think it was, yeah, watermelon. And watermelon too is a real popular item, and it was all mixed together with a much more natural bedding, a whole bunch of leaves. So I imagine that last feeding they got 12 days ago was really not going to last very long. So I'm not sure we're going to see much, if any, leftovers of the last feeding. However, some of the foods that they got in previous feedings were materials that are going to take a lot longer to break down. You know, stuff like these. These are all the same sort of stuff, some sort of a veggie material that I did not freeze before placing down into the worm bin. Because normally everything that I give my worms, nearly everything, goes into the freezer first. But like none of the stuff they're getting today was in the freezer. Although oddly enough, I did actually freeze those sliced up pieces of avocado seed. Everything else just came straight out of the cupboard. Here's the stem of a pumpkin. Pretty good size object that they're going to be working on for a long, long time. I've got a feeling anything that we fish out of here as a leftover is going to be stuff that goes quite a way back. This was a corn cob that had all of its kernels on it, and believe it or not, there's still one or two kernels on here. Last time we checked in here 12 days ago, I remember kind of pressing up against one of those kernels and it sprayed juice in my face. It sort of startled me. Normally worms in my wormery don't get corn cob that's still got the kernels on it. They usually just get the corn cobs. So these little guys were treated to a special corn cob that was still including all of its yummy kernels. So the other bin also got some corn cob, but since I didn't really have two pieces that had the kernels on them still, that other system just got some corn cob pieces. So I've been sort of just excavating to one side and, you know, salvaging leftovers on the other side. This is just another piece of pumpkin stem. So I've got pumpkin stem piling up over here. More old veggies. This is potato peel. So yeah, none of those things that we gave them last time are going to show up in here as leftovers, if you ask me. We're not going to see any pieces of carrot peel. We're not going to find any of that stuff that we gave them last time. Everything we're finding in here as leftovers are all things that go back further to previous feedings. The only thing we're finding is leftover bedding, leftovers of the abundant leaves that we added as bedding for the last feeding. It does seem to me like we're going to need to make a fairly good size hole to make room enough to place today's feeding into, and it does seem like we're sort of encountering a good sized stash of worms enjoying the last feeding. I think like we do sometimes, we're going to give these little guys a moment or two to sort of settle down into their bedding before we proceed here. And there's a banana stem. And then we'll pick up where we left off in a minute or two. I don't know, I've been looking at the stuff that we need to squeeze in here, and it just feels like we need more space, or at least a larger hole. So I think I'm going to also try to shove this edge up a little bit in order to widen the gap over here a bit more. Then I think we could begin constructing the system's feeding zone. So we've got a good amount of stuff that we're going to be trying to squeeze in here as the bedding for today's feeding. So now let's see if we can sort of spread this stuff out in such a way that it's not just going to go in as a big clump. Definitely a nice, generous portion of bedding going in here as the foundation for today's feeding. And let's not forget, one of the things that we were going to do here was try to account for the fact that this system did not have a feeding zone indicator. So while the other system's going to be recycling its old feeding zone indicator to become bedding down in the feeding area, this one's going in here to compensate for the fact that this one doesn't have one to be used that way. And then I think the foods can start coming in. Then we'll just hang on to this feeding zone indicator here at the end to give it to them as the replacement. Well, the replacement for one that was not even here. So let's see here. Man, these pieces of veggies must go back 3 or 4 feedings at this point. It was only a feeding or two ago when I was finally able to start cracking these pieces of vegetable into smaller chunks. And as interesting as it is to see sometimes how a piece of material gradually gets broken down by the worms, I didn't really do that with that intent or with, with any interest in these particular veggie pieces as, being something that we could observe over time. I just, for whatever reason, hadn't had a chance to place them into the freezer. So that's kind of how they ended up in here without being frozen first. Everything that I freeze first and then feed to the worms just seems to go much more quickly. So I've been trying to make that a habit. So now the foods that they're going to get today, I'm going to place that right here momentarily, but we've also got a little bit more bedding material we're going to place in here, right? We wanted to use some of these soiled napkins too. We're definitely filling this hole up pretty quickly, but I think we're going to be okay in terms of how much space we need to get this feeding completed. We've also got some soiled napkins. We'll save a couple for the other bin as well as a couple strips of this newspaper. Now we've got a fair split, I believe, when it comes to setting this system up. And then I think we can start piling in today's feeding. So here's these berries. Hopefully they appreciate these berries. They're all, if you ever held a pile of raisins or tried to pull raisins out of a tub, ones that have maybe been sitting around for a while or had a chance to sort of stick to each other, that's what's going on here. These are pretty well stuck to each other. They're gonna go in little clumps, I suppose, at this point. So I'm not gonna sit here trying to detach all these berries from one another. So hopefully this is something that the worms appreciate. Certainly not a feeding that's coming in with much, if any, moisture content whatsoever. Perhaps the berries have a tiny bit of moisture remaining in them, but these coconut pieces certainly don't. And these chunks of the avocado pit don't really have much, if any, moisture in them either. So maybe now would be a good time to spritz in a little bit of this BTI, mosquito dunk solution. I usually try to make a habit of applying this stuff in the very beginning to coat the top surface of the material that's in the bin, in case that's, maybe where the The flying insects that I'm trying to combat with this stuff are camped out, but I kind of forgot to apply it early on, so better late than never. Maybe at the end we can put a little top coating of this stuff on too. And I think as sort of a little topper for the feeding, we're going to put in a little spritzing of my worm chow. Yummy, yummy. So I think we're at that point now where we can begin covering up. So you know what? Let's use this also as an opportunity to examine what the outskirts of the systems look like. And as we do that, we'll just, as a secondary effect of doing that, we'll just end up covering up the hole that we placed today's feeding into. I found a few chunks of potato peel out there. I found plenty of worms. The moisture content of the material seems pretty good. So things seem to be in pretty decent shape in this system from a moisture perspective. That's pretty cool. So now maybe we can just sort of use some of this excavated material over on this opposite side. Drag it over here, even though this has a good bit of bedding material mixed in. I like kind of moving some of the bedding material to the outskirts of the system sometimes, because the feeding areas always seem to get all the fresh bedding. However, the outskirts usually just sort of end up becoming a big pile of castings only. So I like to drop in some stuff for the worms to work on out there too, if I can. I wonder how things on this edge look. Similarly, we're finding some potato peel bits. Here too, things look pretty nice. There's a good moisture content. There's plenty of worms in here. They seem happy and healthy. So I think before we level off, we're going to use some of this excavated leafy material over there too. Try to get some of these potato peels over there too, and make sure everything's beneath the surface. Now I guess as we spread out, this is where we start to bump into all the worms that we pulled out of the feeding area earlier, because they were just in that big pile of excavated material. So we get to say hello to them one more time before we finally say goodbye. I try to lay everything out to the side of me over here in such a way that I don't forget stuff. So hopefully I got everything. And you know what? On that same exact note, we're going to use this as a chance to slightly treat the top surface of this system with this BTI. Not so much for the moisture content, but more for the BTI. And it's just going to become a routine in all my systems to start putting this stuff in to make sure if there's any flying insects trying to make themselves at home, that they are unable to propagate their numbers. I think we're almost done here. Let's bring in one of these replacement top coverings. Nice replacement feeding zone indicator, nice replacement top covering, and then we can get everything buttoned up over here. Very nice, very nice. I like it when the capacity of the system is being better utilized this way. It's kind of become one of my goals in all my systems to make better use of the available space in these bins rather than just gradually working my way to full. Trying to almost operate at nearly full, and as the worms work it all down, keep backfilling it. And by giving them more volume to reside in, we're maybe also, kind of enticing them to expand their numbers to fill in the available space. All right, let's get that next bin out here. We're kind of dragging our feet. I want to get this other one done too, and we'll be done. Okay, now sometimes I sort of pick up the pace a little bit on, subsequent bins after the first one's been completed. Because usually when I got multiple bins, they're kind of set up and operating in very similar fashions to one another. However, in the beginning we sort of gave a little intro into the materials I was going to use. We got a little distracted by some breeding worms out on the top. We were sort of exploring a little bit, trying to figure out how we're going to make everything fit, but now we're just sort of following suit with what we've already sort of established in the first system. So I think we should be able to sort of copycat to a certain point what we did in the first bin here and maybe get things done a little bit more rapidly. So let's get this wormy off of here and kind of prevent him from ending up as jerky off on the tablecloth somewhere. All right, here too we've got ourselves a leftovers of a feeding zone indicator. And you know what? This time I'm going to see about putting in this BTI right here on the top surface, because even if the flying insects do move in, they're only going to occupy the very top layer of the material in the system. And that's where they're at, so that's where the countermeasures should be applied. I mean, the fact that we put it in at the end on the other system is fine, but I think this is maybe a slightly more targeted way of going after what I'm trying to accomplish here. So there we go. That's the reason I had sort of lined it up over here off to my side as the first order of business, to get that in here first before anything else. And before I forget, I'm just going to bring this over and keep it with the rest of the bedding materials we're going to use when we reconstruct the feeding area. And now we can get to exploring what's going on down in this feeding zone. So here too, we've already got some sightings of leftovers, potatoes that were not part of the last feeding, but rather an older feeding. And how do you like that? What are the chances of finding a piece of watermelon this big? Especially one that still has some of the red watermelon on it. Wow. I did not expect that. Not in the least. So watermelon was actually one of the things that were part of the previous feeding. Something I did not think we would see any leftovers of. Something we did not see any leftovers of in the other system. So that was a little surprising. Here's some more of that same vegetable that I was breaking up a little bit in the other system. One that goes back quite a number of feedings, and it's taking so long, I believe, because it was never frozen before being put in here. And here's another chunk of that same veggie material. So that was interesting. Watermelon we found, but I mean, leftover bits of mushroom, leftover bits of carrot peels, I would have to think that we're not going to see any of that. Now, I don't know, if I'm not mistaken, this was the system that we kind of, I don't know, estimated to have a slightly greater population in it than the first system. The first system was, however, as we mentioned earlier, first placed into sort of a breeding environment where maybe they did actually, you know, do the task at hand, and maybe what we're seeing is just the results of that. You know, maybe that is what we're seeing. What we kind of thought we might see in that other system was a possible population explosion, whereas the worms that came into here were simply launched in a much more traditional fashion. They came out of their old home, they were placed into their new home, and that was that. So maybe there was actually a positive result to running the breeder buckets with the worms that we just fed in the other bin. So I don't know. I'd love to hear people's opinions on that in the comments, if you think that that might be an explanation for what we're seeing here. And how do you like that? Another chunk of watermelon. Maybe there's something wrong with this watermelon. I don't get it. Very weird. Watermelon is just one of those things you really do not expect to find in your worm bins, right? So the fact that there is some of it left over in here is a little bit surprising to me. Okay. Now I think we'll do the same here, is just nudge things over a bit in this direction as well. There's another chunk of corn cob. So yeah, here's, you know, we didn't have a full corn cob with the kernels on it, so this system just got a few chunks of corn cob placed in here. Once again, in just an attempt to keep things fair, keep things even. So yeah, I mean, we started out totally uneven by launching the systems with different numbers of worms, launching the other system with, you know, having first placed the worms into sort of a breeding environment first. So, you know, the deck was sort of stacked in the favor of the other the other bins occupants to a certain degree, more so than for the occupants of this bin maybe. So maybe that's the reason we're seeing a slightly greater number of worms over there. So I don't know, we'll see. But that might really explain, you know, why it seemed like the other bin was just so busy down in the feeding area and why we saw no leftovers of the previous feeding. So now these new chunks of cardboard almost makes me want to kind of set up a sort of a lasagna stacking of the food. So you know what? Let's do that. Let's make this bedding a little bit interesting with a little bit of worm chow in it, and then we can place on these fresh chunks of cardboard as sort of the foundation for the fresh foods that they're going to get. And then we can, and let's not forget, we've also got a few other little random pieces of bedding type materials to include down in here. And then we can come on in with the fresh food, or should we put in the old foods? Let's put the fresh food in here, setting aside temporarily their feeding zone indicator. And once again, I'm just going to attempt to spread these things out a little bit across the feeding area without taking up too much time or effort in the process, hopefully. I guess we'll see if they like it. I imagine they will, although I'm not too familiar with whatever those berries were. Kind of makes me wonder if they were actually, you know, berries that were like not raisins, or were they already kind of raisin-ish when they were first placed in here. So it feels to me like we didn't really leave ourselves with much material with which to stack up another layer of kind of like if we're going to attempt to mimic a lasagna layered configuration here. We need something to separate the layers a little bit, right? So we'll do that, and then we can start restoring some of these older food bits that we encountered along the way back down into the feeding area. Okay, and I can't remember, did we apply grit to the freshly added foods? We might not have, so we'll just plop it in here. And I know we already put a little bit of worm chow in to try to entice them to explore that lower level of bedding. We're going to put in a little bit more right there. So I think we're getting there. Now it's just a matter of covering up the feeding area like we did before. We're just going to use that as a reason to explore the outreaches of the bin. Now I'm starting to question whether or not we're really shy on worm population here. It just seems to me like maybe they've, I don't know, come over to this edge of the bin for whatever reason. Because now we're suddenly encountering a great number of worms just hanging out over on this edge of the bin. So maybe we're really not so imbalanced when it comes to the population of these two systems. Maybe for whatever reason the worms are just sort of exploring the outreaches of the bin in this particular instance, and maybe on the other edge too. Maybe we'll bump into a whole bunch of them when we check over there. There's another piece of corn cob. Really quickly grab a handful of the stuff that's down in here, see how it's doing. Not quite as many worms, but still enough to make me believe that everything's just doing fine over there, nothing to be concerned about. As long as worms are hanging out in the material and they look happy and healthy and there's ample moisture, I think things are in pretty good shape. So these are two somewhat different bins, and I've been just attempting, obviously, to harmonize, to sort of get them on the same page to a certain point, despite their somewhat different launches. There's somewhat different population amounts with which we began each system. It does seem to me like we are gradually getting to the point where they're going to be almost identical from almost every aspect in terms of how all the previous feedings have been getting set up, right down to every minor detail if possible. Not to say that any of that's even important, you know, but it's just stuff that I kind of like to do. It's almost like a novelty to have, paired up bins being very similar to one another so that the presumed similarities can be used as a basis for comparison, so that if you see something going really good in one system or perhaps going really bad in one of the systems, then you've got a point of reference to say, hey, if both systems are doing, both systems were managed identically, then what is it about one or the other system that's causing it to do really well or do really poorly? Possibly helping narrow things down when it comes to the, determination of what's causing success or failure. So I think we're done here. I've got a few things I've got to put away and clean up, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. Before I go, though, really quickly, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. I think it's going to be a slightly longer than usual one, but it was a fun one. So before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you one more time. And before you go, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.